without wasting any other time, I'm going to introduce our second speaker. He's coming from a background of international, organizational mindset. Our next speaker is Mr. Edwin Tambara. He is the Director of External Affairs for the African Wildlife Foundation. A short intro about Edwin is that Edwin heads the External Affairs, which is the US-based office, where he works with multilateral organizations such as the United Nations and the World Bank, as well as the US and Canadian governments, to influence sound conservation policies and encourage development financing that supports nature conservation in Africa. So Edwin joined the AWF in 2013, having learned with the African Leadership University and also the University of Zimbabwe. So, Mr. Tambara, if you can hear us, please go ahead and give us your presentation.
Knowledge, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's still mid-morning where I am, but it's a pleasure of mine to be here and to interact with you and share with you a bit of what has been going on with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we certainly thank the ministry for being a partner in this and some of the other work we are doing in Zimbabwe. So my task today is to share with you, let me share my screen. I hope everyone can see my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, we can see.
Yes, we can go ahead.
Fantastic. Yeah, so my task today is just to provide you with an overview of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, what it is all about, how it came about, what it is trying to achieve, what has been achieved so far. I will talk a bit more about the zero draft, which has since been crafted towards this purpose. And I'll also touch a bit about Africa's position going into this whole process. And I'll touch on the next steps and the timelines for completion of the draft towards COP15. So, as you might be aware, and I have to say, apologize for those who are quite familiar with the process. I try to make sure that it goes back to the basics so that those who haven't interacted with this process, at least they are well grounded in what it is. So please bear with me if I get into so much detail that you might already be familiar with. But the biodiversity framework is essentially looking to carry over from the 2011-2020 strategic plan, which had some targets, and most people have come to an agreement that we haven't really been able to achieve most of the targets that were set in this strategic plan. So now the general feel is that we need an ambitious framework to make up for the need to halt biodiversity loss and so many other elements. So in COP14, which was held in Egypt in November 2018 or 19, the COP adopted a comprehensive and participatory framework of developing a new global biodiversity framework, which we have come to know as the post-2020 GBF now. And the framework was now looking on to succeed on some of the achievements that were made with the Aichi targets, but build on those and really make sure that this time we get right some of the elements that we didn't get right with the last strategic plan. So the process for development of this strategic plan is basically, to simplify it, is in 3 phases. Phase 1 really included regional consultations, and this happened mostly in 2019. Regions like Africa would sit together and start discussing about some of the elements of this strategic plan. The same way other regions, Europe, Asia, South America, were sitting down and having consultations as well and mapping a way forward for their own purposes. The next broad phase is the thematic issues. So consultation on thematic issues. And there are various thematic issues within the framework that need to be discussed in detail and have parties contribute and agree on certain elements. And then the third broad phase now is on negotiation, and there's quite a bit of overlap between phase 2 and phase 3. As you will see, I'll present this later on in a bit of detail. But these are basically the broad phases towards development of the global biodiversity framework. Regional consultations, which have now, I think most of them happened. Thematic discussions, quite a number have happened now, but still there are some which are still going on, like the sustainable use thematic discussion. And then the negotiation phase, and we'll talk more, we'll go more into detail about that, each of those phases. So there was also agreement on how this process should happen and what are the bodies that should be involved and what is going to be their function in delivering this framework. So the COP14 agreed on creating what they were calling open-ended working groups to really lead now the negotiation of this, for this framework. So three working groups events were put on the calendar to really drive the process of developing the framework. And these working groups are co-chaired by Basil van Havre from, I think, Norway, and Francis Ogwo from Uganda. And I should say these gentlemen have done quite a great job of steering forward the process, given the complexity in content and the complexity of interest and parties and the politics involved. But I think they have handled it quite well. Even so, with the disruptions of COVID-19. There are other bodies as well that feed into that process, not necessarily for negotiation purposes, but mostly to enhance the process through information, scientific-based information input into the process. So there is a subsidiary body on scientific, the SBS, and there's a technical and technological advice body, which is known as the SABSTA. So these two main bodies are sort of provide critical information and advice to the process. There are also various, as I mentioned, there are various thematic workshops that are also feeding into the process, which have been designed to focus on specific thematic areas that feed into the convention. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will be adopted at COP15 in China, Kunming, and we'll talk about the deaths as we go along. So, as I said before, with the shortcomings of the previous strategic plan, the general agreement, I think, which we have seen coming forward is that people want a framework for nature and people to exist in harmony. I think despite the various interests and the approaches and the things that people are pushing for, there's general agreement that we need this framework to push forward how nature and people can coexist in harmony. People are looking into a framework that will halt biodiversity loss and put nature on a path of recovery. People are looking for a framework that will create a conducive policy environment for conservation of biodiversity. People are also looking at a framework that will help in prevention of extinctions, recovery of abundance and diversity of life, and retain and restore ecosystems. But also people are looking for a framework that allows them to sustainably utilize and benefit from nature. So those are some of just the general common positions that everyone is looking at with this framework. So I will try and highlight what has come so far in the zero draft. So after a series of meetings, including the first open-ended working group, which was held in Nairobi last year, the co-chairs were able to use material and content from submissions from parties and other external parties to craft a zero draft, which they shared, which was shared by the CBD Secretariat in January this year. And really that early draft was the first document to try to put things together now as we move towards COP15. So basically the structure of the global biodiversity framework it's very simple. It has a vision, it articulates a vision. It also has a mission and goals, targets, and indicators. Those are the basics things that were included in the zero draft. I will not go into the details because I think the draft has been shared with most of you, and you'll be able to see what's in the draft. I should say though, there has been significant progress now since the zero draft was issued out. So some of the things have already changed. Like initially they presented 5 long-term goals. I think these have already been revised to 4. So quite a number of elements have already advanced within the draft. So as you go in your conversations, you just need to take cognizance that some of the elements of the draft have already changed and advanced. And I hope you'll be able to get updated information on that. But basically the goals of the zero draft, the 5 goals were touching on issues like net loss and ecosystem resilience, reduction on percentage of species that are threatened by extinction, maintaining and enhancing genetic diversity, benefits of nature to people, and increasing fair and equitable sharing of benefits. So these are some of the main things that the 5 goals we're touching on. As I say, these have since been revised. I haven't been able to get my hands on the recent goals, but hopefully we'll be able to share in the next few days. The zero draft also had 20 targets, which were presented to support the 5 goals. And these were really largely touching on reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. And I should say, as Mr. Knowledge, as Mr. I'm forgetting his name,
Ndoga.
from the ministry mentioned, the issue of sustainable use is of critical importance to Africa. It's at the core of the objectives of the convention. But I think certain regions, certain elements within the convention have been trying to water down this element, have been trying to influence for an approach that deviates from this core objective of the convention, the sustainable use and benefit sharing. So for Africa, as you will see further on, this is very critical, and it's something that I think as you have your deliberations over the next few days, you really have to think through how can we ensure that sustainable use remains a key part of how we do conservation, and what innovations, modifications, how can we involve our approaches to ensure that they enhance how we do sustainable use. So as I say, the zero draft has already been advanced. Now they are at a stage where they have in place, 0.5 draft, because now a few other elements have been added to the zero draft. There is a draft monitoring framework in place for the post-2020 GBF. And these documents are already available. If you go on the CBD website, there are links to these documents. And I actually think the window is still open for you to provide reviews and inputs on some of the content there. There's also element of linkages between this post-2020 GBF and the 2030 agenda on sustainable development. So linking the GBF to the sustainable development goals, which is also critical, and I think a really good element now to see how these two interface and work towards probably the same goals. There are also indicators for the post-2020 GBF. All this is available on the CBD website, so you should be able to go in, have a look at the draft documents that have been put in place. There are templates for you to be able to provide feedback and suggestions on the drafted text. So I'll talk a bit about the common position for Africa, because I think it's important for you to be aware as you deliberate, because Zimbabwe is certainly a big player as well and has been involved in advancing a common African position. This is important because Africa actually boasts the largest membership in the convention, but unfortunately has not been effective in pushing for resolutions and positions that really advances conservation on the continent, or how we want conservation on the continent to be done. We have been at the mercy of other regions, but I think this is the time for Africa to come together and really advance resolutions that work for conservation in Africa, given our realities, given what we know as the models that work and speak to the aspirations of Africans. So I think this is essential for so many other things. You know, in Africa, as we know, in most cases, our wildlife and biodiversity transcends boundaries. So the best way to manage that is to ensure that we have a framework that allows for biodiversity conservation in those transboundary areas, and the policies are in place to allow that to happen. But also, this common position will allow for effective coordination among African parties when it comes to implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So again, in Egypt's 2018, November 2018, African ministers of environment came together and endorsed the top priorities for Africa going into this GBF process. So these are the top 11 priorities that Africa should push forward within this GBF process. And this now has provided guidance to the African group of negotiators within the CBD. This is really has been their fundamental or their guiding framework for how they negotiate or how they craft position for Africa within the GBF. So as you can see, these are the 11 priorities. They are not comprehensive and all-encompassing, but they touch on some of the most critical things. I think the African group of negotiators has already done some work around this to expand on this and include some of the elements that are not well represented within this, but are well nested under some of these priorities. So what are some of the key issues for Africa within this convention? I think Africa wants to see, as I said before, Africa wants to see a clear balance between the three objectives of the convention: conservation, benefit sharing, and sustainable use. As I said before, the tendency within the last decade or the last year has been more emphasis on conservation, so to say, and watering down on benefit sharing and sustainable use. But Africa is saying that this convention was put forward with these three objectives, and we need to ensure that all the three objectives are reflected in the post-2020 GBF, but also the two other elements. Conservation cannot be successful if we do not have benefit sharing and sustainable use as part and parcel of what we want to achieve with conservation. So Africa is not asking for sustainable use just for the sake of wanting to utilize wildlife or other natural resources, but for us to be able to achieve the conservation gains and goals we are setting forward. These are the vehicles for us to get there. Africa is also looking for a strong theory of change that will result in the required transformation. So most of these key issues also emanated from Africa's review of the zero draft. So these are some of the key issues they were expressing, that we think the zero draft needs to strengthen or include these kind of elements. So a strong theory of change, and as we know, a theory of change will really articulate, look at the assumptions we are making when we are developing the goals and the targets, to really ask ourselves, how are we going to achieve what we are setting out to achieve? Sorry, I have to keep looking at the waiting room because somehow I'm the one who is supposed to admit new people going in. So
no, don't worry about that, Edwin. We have people who will be doing that mission.
Oh, great,
Yeah.
Thanks, because I've been getting prompts to admit people. Thanks. So those are some of the critical elements, that critical issues that Africa has been pushing for. Resource mobilization, scientific cooperation, technology transfer, capacity building, financial mechanisms that provide for special fund for biodiversity are some of the issues Africa has been pushing for. And these elements have been missing or have not been prioritized within the last strategic plan. And Africa is saying, unless we pay attention to resource mobilization, to capacity development, this new strategic plan is going to fail, because those are the critical elements for success. So we need to make sure that these negotiations pay adequate attention to those elements. Africa is also looking to see how this global biodiversity framework can strongly address the issue of sustainable use of biodiversity and sustainable development. How do you develop, but at the same time ensure that you do conservation? For other regions, the way they were able to develop was actually through destruction of their biodiversity. But Africa does want to take a different pathway, but it is probably a costly pathway. It requires innovation, it's gonna require resources. So how do we make sure that we achieve these multiple goals? And the global biodiversity framework is probably one of the areas to make sure that we provide the direction for that. So I will touch a bit on the next steps and the timeline. So as I mentioned before, if you look at the 3 phases, phase 1 has pretty much been done with. Phase 2, looking at beginning of the negotiations with open-ended working group 2 that was done in Rome just before the COVID situation exploded globally. I think that was the last meeting when parties and other interested parties were able to meet and discuss on the zero draft. After that, there wasn't any room to have physical meetings because of COVID. So the Secretariat had to move and organize most of the discussions to happen virtually. And most of the thematic discussions that had been lined up had to happen online. And as I said, there were a number of thematic discussions around resource mobilization, accountability, capacity building, synergies, and sustainable use. So currently, the ongoing ones are on synergies and sustainable use. And as I said, we are probably now at draft 0.5, which is being worked on towards the SABSA meeting in November this year, which has been scheduled for, I think, Quebec, Canada, and SPI as well. So those are going to be the next meetings in the process towards Kunming, after which they'll have draft 1.0, borrowing from the inputs from SABSTA and SPI and from the thematic discussions. Draft 1.0 should be out. I think open-ended working group 3, which had been originally scheduled for Cali in Colombia in July this year, has now been pushed to January 2021. I think they are still working on whether this will be a physical meeting or it will have to happen virtually. We don't know as yet, but that's the next big event in terms of development of this framework. And as I said before, really at these open-ended working groups, that's where negotiations really happen. The SPI, as I said before, really is not the negotiation platform. So it's mostly about scientific information and any other information feeding into into the process and informing the draft. But real negotiations now happen at the open-ended working groups. And the third one, which is in January, is probably a good event for you to target in terms of having comprehensive contributions for Zimbabwe's position, but also Africa's position. Then the COP itself, COP15, which had been originally scheduled for Kunming, China in October, was now moved to May 2021 from the 17th to the 30th of May in 2021. And that's where parties are expected to deliberate on the framework and approve it if there is agreement. So this is just a detailed look at that time frame. Again, if you want this information, this presentation will be shared and you'll be able to look at the details there. Again, you see from November onwards, a lot of the dates are not yet clear because the Secretariat is still working on this. But I think now the broader timeline to work with is probably that the open-ended working group is going to be in January 2021, and then the COP in May 2021. But again, you never know with the COVID situation, thing might still be adjusted. So there are also other important political meetings that are critical to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process. The UN High-Level Political Forum is one key meeting which is critical. The IMF and World Bank meetings are critical because these are organs that also determine financial flows globally. So it's important to look at what decisions are they making and can they be influenced to support financing for conservation or for biodiversity conservation. Probably the most critical one is the UN Biodiversity Summit of Head of State, which is scheduled for September 2020. Originally, it was supposed to be a physical meeting to happen in New York, but because of COVID now, I think the latest I got is that it's going to happen virtually. But this is a summit that's going to be focused on biodiversity. So everyone is really pushing to influence what heads of state are going to deliberate on, but also is looking forward to some of the concrete things they are going to agree on in terms of supporting biodiversity conservation. The IUCN World Conservation Congress is another critical one. Originally, it was scheduled for, I think, June this year. Again, in Marseille, France, it couldn't happen because of COVID. So it was pushed to January 2 to 15, 2021. But again, depending on how the COVID situation evolves, we will have to see whether this will happen. There are also other key meetings like the G7, the G20. I think the way these meetings deliberate on such issues really sometimes sets the tone on global policy. So getting biodiversity on the agenda, for example, for G20 will be a big win in trying to influence how the globe will move forward, especially in post-COVID recovery. So with that, that's all I had in terms of an overview of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, what it is all about, the process that has been put in place to try and come up with a new framework, the zero draft, what has happened, the improvements that have happened with the zero draft, and now some of the next steps that have been put in play to try and complete or to try and move this draft towards completion for Kunming in May 2021. So I will stop there. And over to you, Knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edwin Tambara. For those who have just joined us, Mr. Edwin Tambara is the Director of External Affairs with the African Wildlife Foundation. He's based in the United States, and his duty is to coordinate the multilateral linkages between the AWF and the governments and the UN systems. So he was presenting to us the overview of the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework. So I'm assuming there were questions being posted. For those who are following us on Facebook, you can still post your questions in the comment section, and then Mr. Tambara will try to answer them as he can. Thank you.
So I think there is I don't know if it's a question or a comment saying, so you believe that adding into the existing framework and accommodating the emerging issues is feasible, considering the poor performance of the previous 10-year goal? It's a good question, and it's a tough ask. But I think it is feasible. It is extremely difficult to be able to fully address all the concerns that were there with the previous plan, just given the complexity in interest of all the parties involved. But I think with some of the issues that we touched on, there is quite good agreement in terms of how ambitious this plan has to be and realistic in terms of putting forward resources and the capacities that are needed to implement it. So I think to some extent it's feasible to accommodate the emerging issues, and maybe to some extent this whole COVID situation has actually helped to put a spotlight on biodiversity and the importance of human interaction with biodiversity. So I think that will help galvanize support from other sectors, other areas of life that were really not, that didn't see biodiversity conservation as an issue. So I think with that, we should be able to see a framework that is quite a bit more ambitious and realistic. And hopefully there will be effort, a lot more concerted effort to put resources and the capacities that are needed to implement it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tambara. I saw Mr. Mundoga raise their hand. Mr. Mundoga, if you have any question?
Thank you, Knowledge. Mine is not a question, but a comment, but maybe just to start by appreciating the fantastic presentation by Edwin Tambara. It's very informative. It's basic, but it provides all the information I think that is required for us to be able to have a meaningful discussion in the next 2-3 days. But one issue that he raised that I just wish to flag out is to do with the balance of the 3 objectives. He talked about conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing. I think you might be interested to know that the issue of sustainable use is also a key issue when we talk of CITES. So as we discuss the CBD, I think let's not discuss it in isolation. Let's also think through the other conventions where similar processes and work is going on and what is happening. I think Edwin rightfully indicated that the common concern for Africa is to see a balance in the three objectives. But we are concerned that there is more focus on conservation, which is also an issue that is happening in CITES. So as we deliberate, I think let's also, I think in the next 2-3 days, let's also look at how these kind of issues are also playing out in the other conventions. Because remember, biodiversity, CBD is the key central convention to all these other conventions. So that was just my comment to say, let's discuss this, looking at all those other aspects. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Mundoga. Mr. Tambara, I want to add any comment on that, or we can go to the next question?
Well, I think I can't add much to that. I think it's really critical, and I think for a group like yours, it's even the support that is needed for Mr. Mundoga and company, but also for the African group of negotiators, is for multiple voices to come from Africa advocating for the three objectives of the convention. I think if youth in Africa are bold enough to push, I think people will realize the importance. So this is an area that I think you should pay significant attention to in your deliberations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tambara. There was another hand. I think Elizabeth, she raised the hand. If you can go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. I want to say that it was an amazing presentation that you did. And okay, fine. So I have issues on sustainability. How sustainable are our negotiations? After 5 years to 10 years from now, can we say we are raising a group of young people that are capable to negotiate for our natural resources? Of course, I applaud the work that the AGN is doing, but when it comes to young people, are we capacitating these young people to be good negotiators at the end of it all, especially here in Africa? I feel there's a huge gap when it comes to, junior negotiators. Even the junior negotiators programs themselves that are there, they take a few number of young people, whereas as compared to other developed countries, you get to see that we have quite a number of junior negotiators that are contributing to policy formulation, that are contributing to their substance, to their SBI meetings. So I just wanted to ask, are there any plans of capacitating youth into biodiversity conservation when it comes to, negotiating our natural resources, and how best can young people participate on those platforms? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. That's a very important and practical issue that has to be addressed. I think I'll start by saying with biodiversity, the importance on biodiversity, African parties, the way they approached it really was not at the same level, for example, as they did with climate change. If you compare with climate change, the group, at least for Africa group of negotiators is well organized, well resourced. And actually I interacted with some of them that were working on an initiative to bring up young negotiators now to be part of the platform for succession purposes. So you can see that group actually has, to the extent of an endowment fund, which helps to resource some of their initiatives when they want to meet, when they want to engage in global discussions. They are well resourced, and so they are able to better function. On the other hand, the biodiversity group hasn't been as resourced. It's only after a push that in the last AMSEN in Durban last year, the African Ministers of Environment decided to approve the group to come together and put a common position for Africa. So the early efforts that have gone in has been to help the group to come together and have organized and coordinated efforts for positioning within this process, which was not there. So efforts now are in play to make sure that the group is well supported. AWF has been playing a role to support the African group of negotiators within the CBD, but also other organizations working with the likes of UNEP, WWF, IUCN, really everyone chipping in and providing resources to make sure that the groups are able to meet and develop common positions for Africa. For example, the last support they got when the first draft came, we're able to support them to meet in Eswatini, in Swaziland, to deliberate on the first draft and come up with Africa's response before the meeting in Rome. So just as an example of some of the basic support that was not there. And you can imagine if this was not as coordinated at that level, the same appears to be the case within countries. You know, countries have also not really prioritized this area of biodiversity or their engagement in CBD. Often in the countries we have supported, you see the staff that are working on the convention are under-resourced because there's huge amounts of work that needs to be done. But again, they lack in resources that would allow them to really engage effectively. Sometimes they just pitch up at these meetings within the convention without any substantive positions coming from their own countries because they do not have resources to galvanize stakeholders to be able to come up with positions. So that's the situation I think we find ourselves in. And that has meant that the role of young people in contributing to this has been very, very limited. Just beginning with awareness on biodiversity issues has been very limited. It's only a handful of African youth who really appreciate the importance and role of biodiversity to our livelihoods, to our economic development. So those are some of the things that we need to begin to work on. But specifically to now bringing in young people to be part and parcel of these negotiations and contributing to development of this framework, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And actually, this consultation today is part of, at least for AWF, is part of the effort we are trying to put in to make sure that in the priority countries we identified in Africa, we support young people to be engaged in contributing to this process. And really, it's great that most of the ministries have welcomed this. Most of the ministries are also realizing the potential and the support they can actually get from young people. But I would say beyond that, there is need for intentioned efforts to actually nurture young negotiators to be part and parcel now of the discussions. I think that would need probably some level of investments from both countries and probably conservation NGOs to work out mechanisms for supporting young people who are interested in negotiating. I would say there's still quite a large gap that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. There's another question from Augustine, where he's saying, from Africa's national demands and the need for capacity development, especially when it comes to financing these targets, who has the responsibility for availing funds? Secondly, considering how politically involved the Bretton Woods institutions can be, is it certain that all African countries can receive funding?
That's another very good question and the key issue within the convention and current negotiations, I think. As far as I understand, there are institutions that were set up to try and fund some of these issues within the environment space. For example, the Global Environmental Facility, GEF. But there has been reservations as to how effective the GEF has been, particularly when it comes to biodiversity issues. So other groups have been pushing for a specific biodiversity fund to be established. And of course, resourcing that, the push is for Western developed countries that are well off to be some of the financiers for that fund. As we know, Africa, in most cases, claims not to have resources to be able to implement these plans. But also, Africa is saying if we have to conserve and forego some of the development pathways that allowed the West to develop, then we should be able to get support for the trade-offs we are making, and that support could be used for funding biodiversity conservation. So I think currently there is a push to either enhance or reform the GEF so that it has more funding for biodiversity, or to establish a new biodiversity fund altogether. And I won't be able to speak much to whether all countries will be able to access that funding equitably, because as we know, with these global institutions, financial institutions, sometimes politics come into play depending on who is putting most of the money into the facility. And so that can drive where the money goes and who gets to have access to the financing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tambara. If anyone has got a question, please raise your hand or write your comment in the chat section. So I've got a quick one, Mr. Tambara. Considering that going forward, there's been such concerns, and Mr. Mundoga mentioned that there's a certain shift towards conservation only, and the benefit sharing and the sustainable use concept of the CBD, are not being considered much. What sort of chances do you see this zero draft, pushing that agenda for Africa, considering that funding might be, a key enabler in us achieving all those targets?
So, sorry, Knowledge, would you mind repeating again your question?
No, I'm saying there's a general shift towards conservation, like what Mr. Mundoga was mentioning. And funding is usually key in terms of determining, strategic plans for each country in Africa. What chances do we have to have a common position for Africa, to have that clear balance between those three aspects that you're mentioning?
Thanks. That's a good question. I think right now we have a good chance because of the effort that has been pushed to have African countries deliberating on their own and developing a common position. That was previously, it had happened in an ad hoc way. Already, this has really given Africa room to push for certain positions, even within the events that have happened in the past year and early this year. Previously, I think other regions would actually play a divide and conquer with Africa. They would pull out one or two countries or one region within Africa and sort of entice them with whatever to support their position. But I think, at least within the CBD space, there seems to be an agreement within African countries to work together and push for the positions they want to see together. I think one of the things that is also working in their favor is the numbers I talked about. If Africa is able to stand together behind a common position, given their numbers and the ability to organize support from other regions, they should be able to push for their agenda. For example, what is happening also is that we are supporting the group of negotiators to have dialogue with China, because as you know, China is going to play a big role as the host, and I think co-chair of the COP, I think. And so having China as an ally on some of the positions is going to be key. But equally important, we have other groups have also been supporting Africa to dialogue with Europe and make sure that they come probably to some sort of agreement on some of the issues that they differ on. So that's part of the work that is being done to ensure that Africa is able to push forward some of the positions we are looking at. And basically, I think if Africa is able to stand with one voice, we will be able to push back and say, if sustainable use is not part of the equation, if benefit sharing is not part of the equation, then there is no global framework to talk about. If you look at the whole issue of benefit sharing, when it gets into genetic sequencing and things like that, there has been reports of, other countries coming in and taking, samples of species and taking them to their own countries in gene banks within their own countries. And then companies from there have free access to that information. They can take it, develop products and sell and make huge sums of money, but nothing is shared with the source countries that actually those genetic resources were taken from. So those are some of the issues that Africa is saying that unless this is addressed, then there could be no framework to talk about. They are saying unless this is resolved, then Africa might say we no longer want to share our genetic resources. So I think as long as Africa stands together and is able to craft a solid common position and stay together and be able to galvanize other regions like Southeast Asia also has some similar issues and similar concerns as Africa. South America historically has had similar issues as well as Africa in terms of sustainable use, pushing for rights for local communities and indigenous people. So those are some of the, I think, common elements Africa can use to galvanize for support on its positions. And I think once those regions are able to support Africa, then we should be able to see some of the positions that Africa is pushing forward being adopted.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edwin Tambara. Unfortunately, we may not be able to get all the questions answered, but there was a quick comment. I think it's from Professor Edson Gandiwa, who is from the Chino University of Technology. He says, great presentations, Mr. Mundoga and Edwin. Critical information which would play a key role in forming the intervention in the process is available from the IPABase. Sustainability is essential in various aspects, from financial, ecological, social, etc. But we need to ensure we take into consideration the possibilities of disasters which may derail these. Governments need to commit to these processes and prioritize their funding models from national budgets. So a quick comment, Mr. Tambara, before you leave.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, quite an insightful and great comment from Professor Gandiwa. He was my tutor at the University of Zimbabwe. I don't know if he still remembers. But yeah, it's very critical. And as I said before, with governments everywhere, I think the COVID situation has really helped to highlight why biodiversity is important and why they should be investing in biodiversity. To some extent, African governments had left biodiversity conservation as something to be funded from outside. so I think this really now has helped us to put a spotlight on why we should put emphasis on biodiversity, but also look at the way we are planning developments. Sometimes it's at the cost of biodiversity. We think we are making cost savings, or we are actually furthering our development agenda by tracing on biodiversity, without knowing that, you know, we are increasing the risk of extreme climatic events, possibilities of pandemics and things like that. So these are the things that now that I think we need to keep on pushing and highlighting to our governments, and who is well positioned to do that than the youth across Africa, and certainly in Zimbabwe. I think this group is well positioned to be able to push the ministry, to be able to push the government, and spotlight the issues on why it is important to conserve biodiversity, but also look at how biodiversity can play a role in creating jobs and advancing our economy, and sustaining livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tambara. Mr. Tambara is the Director of External Affairs with the African Wildlife Foundation. He's based in the United States of America, pushing the linkages between the conservation and the multilateral environmental agencies, including the UN and the World Bank. Thank you so much, Mr. Tambara. We want to appreciate all the time and the energy that you gave for this wonderful speech.
Thank you very much, Knowledge, and thank you everyone for listening. It is a pleasure and an honor to interact with you, and I wish you fruitful deliberations and concrete outputs that can really contribute to a sound position for Zimbabwe. Thank you.